Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Awesome, great. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So I'm just going to offer a quick introduction and say hi to our attendees and then turn it over to you, if that's all right.
Sure.
Sounds good. All right, perfect. Hi, everyone that has joined us. Thank you for joining us today for this important event. This event is sponsored by the at-large ACS chapter, the Austin chapter, and the Western New York chapter. Our speaker today is Professor Sahar Aziz. Professor Aziz is a professor of law, chancellor scholar, and Middle East and legal studies scholar at Rutgers University Law School. She is also the founding director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, and the author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom, which he has agreed to talk to us about today. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Aziz.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here virtually with all of you. I very much appreciate ACS hosting me, and I'm thrilled to hear that there are people that are interested in this book that I now call my fourth child. I have 3 biological children and 1/4 inanimate child, The Racial Muslim and Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. And it took me 5 years to write this book. So I am eager to hear what others have to say about it, and eager for the Q&A. So what I thought I would do is I will start with some formal comments and then hopefully have a conversation. One of the benefits of having these Zoom contexts and a relatively smaller audience rather than a very big, large physical audience is that we can do more engagement. So the impetus behind me writing this book was really experiencing firsthand the transition, the very traumatic transition from being a racially ambiguous community to being a racially dangerous community. And that community in particular are Muslim communities in the United States. I was raised in Dallas, Texas, where there's a large Muslim community. It's one of the cities in the country that has a critical mass of Muslims from all over the world, including African-American Muslims. Among the there's an estimated 4 to 6 million Muslims in America. And therefore, you have this population that is just a little over 1%. And yet they're still experiencing such overt and systematic discrimination over the course of 20 years. And that raises this paradox, which is, why would this population, which again is quite small as a percentage of the entire nation's population, but this is a religious minority, and why are they being discriminated against so openly in a country that claims to privilege religious freedom, both in its laws and in its policies? Because that shows a very clear contradiction, if not outright hypocrisy. And it's even more troubling or paradoxical that it's happening at a period in American history when religious freedom rights are part of our culture wars. So you have people that self-identify as conservative evangelicals who are themselves decrying that their religious freedom rights are under attack because they cannot deny someone, for example, contraception if they're a pharmacist, or they would like to. They would like to have more prayer in churches, in schools. They would like to ban abortion because they believe that's against their religion, and so on and so forth. So there's certainly a discussion that's been ongoing for a few decades now, but there's a national discussion and debate that is centered around religious freedom. And yet these same individuals or these same communities, when they're polled about their views about Muslims in the US, they tend to show markedly higher opinions of unfavorability towards Muslims. And the question that really led me to write this book is how can they reconcile that contradiction? How can they believe that their support for American national security policies and practices that pretty explicitly target Muslims. I don't think the government has really tried to hide that. Of course, when they get brought to court, they will claim it has nothing to do with the target's Muslim identities. But I think it's pretty clear, especially based on political rhetoric under Bush, under Obama, and under Trump, that yes, it's the Muslim communities that are going to be bearing the brunt of our national security practices and policies adopted after 9/11 under the auspices of trying to prevent another 9/11 and other smaller terrorist attacks. So that's pretty much what got me to this point. And I was also an advocate within, in DC, within the Muslim American advocacy community. I was representing Muslim advocates pro bono at the time and participating in many roundtables with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. And we were really trying to hash out how we could decrease the discrimination and change policies that were more protective of civil rights and civil liberties for everyone, but especially Muslims, because they were the ones that were most targeted by national security practices. And when the NYPD mass surveillance program broke out and essentially was disclosed or revealed by the Associated Press, for which the journalists received Pulitzer Prizes, we realized that this was, it was even worse than we'd imagined, where you had a 4 to 5 year program that had been hidden from the public, where the NYPD, in collaboration with joint terrorism task forces, which tend to be populated by federal agencies and some local police, but they were spying on 250 plus mosques, Muslim student associations, including at Rutgers University and other universities in the tri-state area, Muslim-owned businesses. And it was just a massive surveillance program, something that we hadn't seen since COINTELPRO. And they were phishing. Also, as more and more reports about this surveillance program were disclosed, it became clear that not only was it textbook racial religious profiling and phishing expeditions without any credible basis or even reasonable suspicion that particular individuals were engaging in unlawful activity, but it didn't bear any fruit in terms of identifying terrorists. Because what was clear, and the more time that went by, the more clear it became, is that the Muslim American community was law-abiding, especially when it came to national security related issues, and that the number of people who had been born and raised in America who were in any way violating the law were very small. And most of the people who were ultimately convicted were people from abroad, right? And yet we were being collectively punished. And then the question was why was that happening? So I was looking as a lawyer, right? I was looking at ways in which, well, it wasn't just me, but a lot of the lawyers in the field and a lot of the advocates were trying to figure out how can we use the courts to hold the federal government and local police departments accountable. And those who are familiar with the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause, it's almost dead letter law at this point, because you have to show intentional discrimination and intentional disparate treatment. And when you're in the national security space, similar to the immigration space, the government only has to meet the rational basis test, and they will say, well, it was because of national security. You had nothing, it was just a coincidence that this person's identity is of this particular religion. So we realized that Equal Protection Clause wasn't going to be very effective if we were going to go through litigation. And then that made me look into Title VI, because New York, as well as many other police forms across the country, regardless whether they're big or small, tend to rely heavily on the federal government for funding, including the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security. And Title VI, as those who are familiar with it, will know that, and I'll just read it very quickly so that to do a little refresher. It essentially prohibits discrimination of service. If an agency or a local or state or even federal or nonprofit, non-governmental organization receives funding from the federal government, they cannot discriminate in their provision of services funded by that funding. However, Title VI only prohibits discrimination based on race, color, and national origin. It does not prohibit discrimination based on religion. And that is actually a major flaw, I think, in the statute that should be amended. But in the meantime, it made me kind of think of bigger questions, which was, even though Muslims are not a race, and in a phenotypical sense, they were most certainly being treated like a race. The way that they were profiled and targeted mirrored in many ways the way that African Americans had been racially profiled, for centuries, but more recently in the war on drugs and the war on crime, and ultimately in this entire mass incarceration system, stop and frisks and so on. So I thought, there's something more here. This isn't simply about religious bigotry, right? This is really much more, I think, racial discrimination and racialization of Muslims explains the phenomena and the reason why there is this paradox, and helps to kind of unpack and explain why people don't think that they're being anti-American insofar as undermining religious freedom rights when they mistreat Muslims. And it's because they see them and treat them as a race. And in America, racism is part of its history. Right? In contrast to religious freedom, the country was built on racism, specifically anti-Black racism. It was built on the enslavement of Africans and the genocide of Native Americans. So there isn't the same, at least cognitive or conscientious commitment to religious freedom the way, or to racial justice the way there is with religious freedom, because of the history of the country. So I want to step back just a little bit and talk about, give some definitions and admit first that I am a critical race theorist, which apparently is something that's not very popular in some quarters of the country. And therefore, I recognize that race is a social construction and not a biological fact. But race does have real life material consequences. And I adopt Edward Bonilla Silva's definition of race, which is, quote, an organizing principle of social relationships that shapes the identity of individual actors at the micro level and shapes all spheres of social life at the macro level. So as a result, racism arises from racialized social systems where economic, political, social, and ideological levels are partially structured by the placement of actors in racial categories and races, and then that causes them to adopt different interests that are often in competition with each other. I also adopt Derek Bell's Black-White paradigm, which proffers that Blacks, or collective Blackness, however that's socially constructed, is permanently at the bottom of an American racial hierarchy, and whiteness, however that's socially constructed, is permanently at the top. Now, my argument, or my book, takes that theory one step further and says it's not just a racial hierarchy, it's actually a religious racial hierarchy. And so the first half of the book goes into depth about how three particular religious minorities, Jews, Catholics, and Mormons, were subjected to racialization, which had the consequences of multiple forms of discrimination because of their religious identity. And so even though they were legally white, just like Middle East and North Africans are legally white under the census, they were not given the full benefits and privileges of social whiteness. And a large part of that was because of their religious identity. Now, phenotype did matter, and the way they look, the way you look, certainly matters, but the race studies in America and the popular perceptions of race is often overemphasizes the physical characteristics and kind of overlooks how religious identity can also cause all forms of discrimination and ultimately racialization of those religious minorities. So I'll just highlight a few points from that era which is primarily the early 20th century, is during from the mid 19th century to the early 20th century, there was a white nativist backlash that was very much similar to today's xenophobia against Latinos, Muslims, and Asian immigrants. And that was because over the course of 100 years, from 1830 to 1930, 38 million immigrants immigrated or came to the US. And 16 million of them, half of them, came just between the years of 1900 and 1930. Now, to give you some perspective, the population estimate in 1870 was about 70 million. So this is a major increase in terms of the percentage of the population. And as a result, New York City's population was 70%, 76% immigrant. This is in 1920. Chicago's population was 72% immigrant, and Cleveland's population was 69% immigrant. So immigrants were the vast majority in major urban areas, especially in the North and the Midwest and the Northeast. And these immigrants were primarily Catholic and Jewish. So they were not Protestant, and they were not from England, and they were not from other parts of Northern Europe, Northwest Europe, where they may look more like the English, the original settlers. And also their religions were different. And as a result of their religions, people presumed all sorts of negative or imputed negative traits upon them. And this is when you get into many anti-Semitic racial tropes, as well as anti-Catholic racial tropes that are directed at the Italians and the Irish Catholic. And so there's an entire, at least, I would say 7 or 8 decades, and there's a literature which I cite that talks about this era. But what has not been, I think, given enough credit in that analysis is how religion ultimately racialized that. And therefore, we need to understand that era and examine it to see how that is similar or different than the post 9/11 era, where Muslims were racialized on account of their religious identity. Now, a few other kind of important points to note is over the course of 60 to 70 years, especially starting in after World War I, but really peaking after World War II, there was a shift where whiteness was being socially reconstructed and expanded. And Jews and Catholics in particular were working with Protestants in order to shift the national identity from a Protestant national identity to a Judeo-Christian national identity, which is what we have today. But that took an enormous amount of effort and lobbying and a coming of age of the children and grandchildren of these immigrants from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe and Ireland. And ultimately, they then became accepted into whiteness. But that took, again, many decades, which then begs the question of what's been happening over the last 2 decades to Muslim Americans that are a much more diverse group in terms of national origin and also phenotype and how they look. What will be the future for them? But I'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, when you then shift if you kind of look at that as the background, and then you shift to say, well, how does this have any relevance to Muslims, particularly post 9/11? Well, first you've got to look pre 9/11, because the stereotypes were there that Muslims were barbaric, or they were savage, or they were despotic, uncivilized, and violent. It didn't all just happen on 9/11. It was that, but they were dormant and they would ebb and flow. And the reason why they kept they were so sustainable over time is because every time there would be some conflict between the United States and a Muslim majority country, or there was a conflict there in which the US played a role or was on one of the sides of the conflict, you would have media attention that would perpetuate these negative stereotypes. So, for example, in 1948, when Israel was created, there were 2 phenomena happening at the same time. So the first was that there was a tremendous amount of guilt, collective guilt by the American population, especially American Christians, for not really doing anything to help Jews in Eastern Europe who were being annihilated and sent to death camps and concentration camps. So, and there were ships that had literally come to the shores of America and were turned back. So America had not helped Jews in any way or offered them a refuge. And to the contrary, most Jews who could get out often went either to Western Europe or they would go to the Middle East, including Palestine. So when Truman recognized Israel, the portrayals, the way in which that happened to justify what was ultimately a settler colonial project, because there were millions of people in Palestine that were natives, that were the indigenous population. Some of them were Jewish, who had been there for centuries. And the way that that was justified in the media was that these were the heathen barbarian Muslims, those who were under the occupation previously under World War I of the Ottoman Turks, and they were uncivilized, whereas the Jews who were mostly Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe who were migrating, and some of them were also from Western Europe, were considered more civilized, more modern. They were European, and that they would come and they would turn the desert into flowers and into farms. And that was very intentional, to make the natives seem savage, just as we did, or just as the Europeans and the English did with the Native Americans. So that was kind of the beginning of at least what we call American Orientalism. And it was built on the back of European Orientalism, which, if anyone's read Edward Said's work, he goes into some great detail about the relationship between Europe and the Muslim majority world, and how Islam has always been a foil and kind of the mirror to show why Europe is more modern and how they are more inferior. But also recommend a book by Joseph Massad called Islam, Liberalism in Islam, which is a really, really informative book about the history of Orientalism and its relationship with Islam. So then you have multiple other events. You have the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, the 1973 Arab oil embargo, the 1979 Iranian Islamic Revolution, and the 1991 Gulf War, the 1993 World Trade Center attack. All of those events, which were major national, international events, the media would go on a frenzy for 6 months, a year, sometimes longer, portraying people from the Middle East as these, essentializing them as these heathen, savage, illiberal, anti-Semitic, anti-democratic, anti-American savages, right? So when 9/11 happened, that was already being built up in American culture. It just wasn't front and center, and it wasn't in the news all the time. And that changed. That completely changed on 9/11. So I'm just looking at my time here, okay? So once we hit the September 11th attacks, that's when you then started to see multiple populations in the US, some of whom themselves, they were the great-grandchildren or grandchildren of those who had been persecuted for their religious beliefs in the early 20th century. And this is also a lesson to be learned, that when particular groups enter the social reconstruction of whiteness, they often tend to forget all of the harms caused by being outside of whiteness, which again, in the racial religious hierarchy, that's at the top of the hierarchy, which you get the maximum amount of privileges in society and essentially first-class citizenship with all of its benefits. And there was an enormous amount of support for the war in Afghanistan, which was quite protracted and ultimately caused us to occupy and create a puppet government there, which clearly had no legitimacy because it collapsed immediately when the US Army left and then the Taliban took over, which I think speaks volumes about the role of America in nation building, and it's not sustainable. It's an extremely expensive endeavor and it doesn't work. So, but again, there was no space to even debate that because you were either for us or against us, right? You were with them or with us. And there was no nuanced debate or discussion that took into consideration the complexities of a country like Afghanistan with a very diverse population, a very complicated history, in a very challenging location right within Central Asia, and having those are the conversations that have to be had if the U.S. is going to get involved, and also a way to make sure that the natives, the indigenous people, the Afghans themselves have some say in it rather than just the ones that we handpick. There was also tremendous support for the war in Iraq, which I think now has been completely condemned as a failure. We've spent billions of dollars, thousands of American lives, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives have been sacrificed, and the country is not very stable, and it's really unknown when it will stabilize. So while Saddam Hussein was an awful dictator and a brutal dictator, going to war there and under false pretenses, which was claiming that there was weapons of mass destruction when in fact there wasn't, is made things much worse, and ultimately caused the U.S. to lose its credibility in the Middle East and North Africa even more than it had prior to the war in Iraq. And then domestically, there was tremendous support for all forms of racial and religious profiling, from being added to, Muslims were added to watch lists. They didn't know, they weren't told when they were added. They weren't told why they were added. They didn't know how to get off the watch list. And they all, as a result, they were harassed every time they went to the airport, oftentimes missing their flights, having to arrive 4 or 5 hours early because they were consistently frisked and all of their stuff was searched, all of their luggage was searched, which is a very humiliating experience, and also signals to the public that, yes, you're guilty. The government doesn't trust you, so we shouldn't trust you either. They had FBI agents visiting them at work and at home under the, claiming to ask for voluntary interviews when they were in quite coercive circumstances. And oftentimes the FBI agents would set up people to lie so that they could threaten to prosecute them for making a false statement to a federal agent, which can result in an 8-year sentence if it's international terrorism related. It's usually a 5-year max sentence. But then they would use that to flip them as informants. There were informants sent to mosques, and many of these stories started to come out, a few years later. But people in the Muslim communities were very suspicious of how the government was targeting them. School kids were getting bullied in schools. There were mosques that were being denied zoning licenses in order to be built or expanded. Hate crimes was on the rise and had risen significantly. I think 1,500% from 2000 to 2001, and then it kind of stabilized somewhere in the middle. But it's been, Muslims are now a consistent target in religiously based hate crimes. And then we saw the election of Donald Trump, who openly campaigned on 2 issues: xenophobia, anti-immigration, and Islamophobia, right, anti-Muslim. And he passed policies accordingly. The first of which was the Muslim ban, his very first executive order that was issued. And that was in no way considered shameful. It was no way seen as anti-American. He won. So if you're that minority that the president of the United States and all of his advisors can go on TV with a straight face and blame you for all problems and claim that you are an enemy of the state, that you're a fifth column, that you're a Trojan horse, that your religion teaches you to be violent, and that we shouldn't let you in and we should try to get rid of as many of you as possible, that has a very traumatic effect collectively. And then it makes us have to ask, do we really have religious freedom in this country? What are the racial boundaries of it? And then how does race and religion intersect? So I've spoken, I think, enough, and I'll stop here just to say that I'm looking forward to your questions. But hopefully those of you who are online and those who listen afterwards will take the time again to read The Racial Muslim, because what I provided was a very brief synopsis, but I found the experience of researching and writing it to be quite illuminating, and I hope that my readers will share that experience when they also read the book. Thank you very much.
Right. If you have any questions for Professor Aziz, I believe you can press the raise hand button and I can let you talk. I haven't done a webinar before. I've done plenty of Zoom calls in this COVID era, but not a webinar. But I think that's the way it works, is you raise your hand and I'll let you speak. So does anybody have any questions? I have a couple of questions if
Sure.
it doesn't look like. You mentioned like towards the end that you spent a lot of time like researching, obviously, and that shows. What was kind of the most shocking thing that you learned through your research? Was there ever a moment where you just like kind of had to take a step back and like, whoa, like?
Yeah, I think the most surprising component, which isn't what I had expected to be the surprising component, but you know, many of these surprises are because they tend to contradict what you learn in school, or they're completely lacking in our education system. So the one notable lesson for me from the research was how effective the institution of American slavery almost nearly, if outright, eliminated Islam within African American communities. And I mean, I knew that approximately 30% of enslaved Africans were Muslim, and they had come from parts of West Africa where Islam had been there for centuries. But I had not realized how effective, you know, from 1619 all the way to the early 1900s, which is when you saw the Nation of Islam. And I talk about that in the book, The Creation of the Nation of Islam, and the Moorish Science Temple in 1913, 1917, which is about when the Great Migration starts to head north, right, to the cities of Chicago and Newark and Cleveland and so on, and Detroit. But effectively, when an enslaved African was discovered to be Muslim, it was just one more reason to believe that he was a heathen and he was a savage. And he was not allowed, or she was not allowed, to practice her faith. So they had to practice in secret. And the first generation who came, I think, generally did find a way to practice in secret because they were taught their religion. They knew how to practice their religion. They brought it with them. The problem was that over time, it became increasingly difficult for enslaved Africans to hold on to the religion because they were forced to convert to Christianity, so they would hide, right, if they were Muslim. And also, it's a very communal religion, and you need to also be able to pass it down to your children. And it's not as if there are schools or there are mosques or there is a larger community of Muslims and extended family. And at the same time, you also have part of the cruelty of slavery is that children would be sold off, spouses would be split up and sold off, families would be split up through selling and reselling of slaves. And therefore, if for any reason there was a community or there was a family union that was Muslim, that would, you know, by design, the families were broken up because enslaved Africans weren't considered human. And over time, again, 200 years, 300 years, it became very difficult to hold on to the religion. And there was really no one to teach those who were born and raised here, especially after the importation of new slaves was abolished in the early 1800s in the US. And there are some exceptions because there's a few communities, just like little pockets in the Sapelo Islands and a few other places, but that's a very small minority. So that was really notable for me. And it helped to kind of explain why there just were not very many African Americans who were Muslim before what many will call the reversion back to Islam through the Nation of Islam and through the Moorish Science Temple. But then ultimately in the 1970s, the Nation of Islam under Warthin Muhammad, who's one of the Elijah Muhammad's sons, they then, most of them, I think it's about 80, 85%, kind of formally declared themselves Sunni Muslims. And the other 10, 15% remained in Nation of Islam following Louis Farrakhan. And there are some differences in theology and rituals between the Nation of Islam and what we kind of call global Sunni Islam.
That's really interesting. I remember like learning in school how there was a mass effort to kind of convert a lot of slaves, but I never kind of thought about what religion those slaves were, if that makes sense. I know that.
Yeah, not all of them were Muslim. There were many other religions.
Yeah,
but 30%.
It kind of makes you think.
Yeah,
definitely. The other question that I had, if nobody has their hand raised, how can attorneys who are kind of really interested in these issues be more involved and take more of an active role in not solve these issues are hard to solve, but like be a part of solving these issues?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is read my book,
of course,
because being informed is important. The other is I would recommend getting on the listservs or newsletters of organizations that work on the civil rights that affect Muslim, Arab, South Asian communities. And I'll put a pitch for the center that I founded at Rutgers called the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. The website is csrr.rutgers.edu, and we have a newsletter that goes out, not very frequently, so we won't spam you. And we have a lot of really great events that we record, and they're all on our YouTube channel. But there's many other organizations. There's Muslim Advocates, there's the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, the Arab American Institute, SALDEF, which is the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund, SALT, South Asians Leading Together, SIT Coalition, SIKH. So there's quite a few. That is in some ways the silver lining of the post 9/11 era, is it really forced out of necessity these communities that again are quite diverse to build institutions to defend their rights, because they realized that no one else was going to defend their rights. And while there were some allies that were very important, like the ACLU, like the Center for Constitutional Rights, but at the end of the day, if you're not the one that's being affected, you're not going to be as vested in addressing the problem. The other suggestion I would have is, being an advocate for ensuring that when there are discussions about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that Muslim, Arab, and South Asian voices and experiences are included, whether it's experts that come to speak, whether it's trainings, whether it's literature and resources that are distributed, because I think that those perspectives sometimes are neglected when those conversations are happening. And I think that they are just as important as the experiences of African Americans, Latinx, LGBTQ, Asian Americans, et cetera. But Muslim, Arab, South Asians are often just not on the table, not on the map, unfortunately. Similarly, when dealing with kind of coalitions or programs, for example, if you're in any kind of practitioner organization, whether it's ABA, whether it's plaintiffs or trial attorneys associations or plaintiffs attorneys associations or specialty associations, is trying to make sure that the programming covers some of the types of legal issues that these communities face. So some of the most common ones, you have a group of like a body of cases of prisoner litigation that is about religious accommodation. And that's actually where you get a large number of African-American Muslims, because they have been disproportionately harmed by the mass incarceration system. So they're disproportionately in jail, just like African-American Christians. But they often are denied requests to pray, to read the Quran, to get halal food, to pray in congregation, which is a mandate on Fridays for men in particular. So that's a body of litigation that if anybody's talking about prisoner rights, they've got to talk about that. The other is bullying in schools. This is a very underreported problem, an under-researched problem. We see in the academy, we don't have enough research about it. But for anybody who's doing education law, you need to put on your radar screen the experiences of Muslim children and Sikh children. And Muslim, includes the Muslim majority world is North Africa, the Middle East, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Bangladesh. And then you have a very large Muslim minority in India, and that includes that's about 114 million people, because they're 14% of a population of 1.4. So there's also Senegal, and there's Mauritania, and half of Nigeria is Muslim, and then you've got Somalia, Sudan. So there's 1.8 billion Muslims in the world. It's the second largest religion after Christianity. So their issues are going to come up, well, what that shows also is when you're representing Muslim communities, or you're trying to understand their civil rights challenges, it is going to intersect with phenotype, right? What they look like. It is going to intersect with their national origin, where they come from. And it is going to intersect with their immigration status, because 30% of Muslims in America are African American. 30% are from the Middle East and North Africa. 30% are from South Asia. 5% are Latinx, and 5% are mixed. So of those 70% that are not African American, 65% of them are either immigrants or children of immigrants that came after 1965, when the Immigration and Nationality Act was amended to lift national origin quotas. So before 1965, something like 90% of the immigrants that came to the US were from Europe, and particularly Northwest Europe. But after 1965, starting in the 1940s, you had the Asian exclusion laws started to get lifted, and the laws started to allow people who are not white to naturalize, to become citizens, because it was illegal before then, and then lifted the quotas. So then it was anyone could immigrate to the US. It didn't matter where you came from. But the point is, if you're someone who works with those communities, you do need to have some understanding of where do your clients fit in this very diverse landscape of Muslim American communities. The other area where you see a lot is in terrorism prosecutions. So if you do criminal defense work, and material support to terrorism has become this linchpin. If you want to know more about that, I would recommend my article, Caught in a Preventative Paradigm, Selective Counterterrorism After 9/11, which you can find on my ssrn.com page, which is Social Science Research Network. Or actually, you can just go to saharazizlaw.com. It's all on my scholarship page. So I've written a lot about that. Employment discrimination is also a real problem, particularly for women who wear the hijab, or people who need religious accommodation in the workplace, people who have thick accents. People's names are Muhammad and Ahmad. In other words, it's very clear that they're Muslim. They can't pass or cover, and not to say that I support them doing that, but some people, that's what they do in order to avoid discrimination. But we do see a lot of employment discrimination cases because these stereotypes infect the workplace. And then hate crimes, right? Just violent, or whether it's oral, verbal assault, or physical assault. That's also something that is, unfortunately, it's underreported, but it's still something that we always, if you follow the Council on American Islamic Relations, care.com, or care.org maybe, they just actually came out with a report where they had 6,800 reported incidents of some form of an anti-Muslim experience, which may or may not be actionable, but it is people who have reported experiences that they believe, or experiences of what they believe are their civil rights have been violated, or at least they've been mistreated on account of their religious identity. So I think there's a lot of literature out there. I will also put in the chat, because on my SSRN page, I have a bibliography that I created alongside two excellent librarians at Texas A&M University that has all, it's a bibliography of all books addressing Muslims or Islam that were published between 1965 and 2020, and we're just about to update it. Let me just put that in the chat. And that will give you plenty to do. And this is about Muslims and Islam in the US. So it's not we intentionally left out anything that had an international focus, and we separated it up by disciplines. So there's anthropology, there's history, there's law. But I think the more you read, the more that you will, the more that you'll want to read. It's a very interesting subject matter. Obviously, I'm very biased, but I do find it there's always more to learn.
You said the name of an article you wrote. Can you just repeat that? The name?
Yeah, Caught in a Preventative Paradigm. Selective Counterterrorism after 9/11, and I can also put that in the chat. Selective Counterterrorism in a post 9/11 America. And that gives a review of the material support to terrorism. Okay, I just put it in the chat.
Perfect, thank you. Does anybody else have questions for Professor Aziz?
It's a quiet group.
It
Hopefully that means that I was very clear and they're just reading the book.
I'm absolutely positive that that's what that means, actually. I definitely really enjoyed your talk, and I'm sure everybody else did. If nobody has any questions, no? Okay. On behalf of ACS, thank you so much or do you have anything else that you wanted to talk about with your book?
No, I just welcome, whoever, once you read it, if you'd like to email me, you can find my information on my website at saharazizlaw.com. And I just hope that those who watch this, who are watching now or watch later, that they realize that nothing is set in stone and we don't have to accept the state of affairs, especially when the state of affairs is unfavorable or not what we want the world to be like. And that I wrote this book to inform people, but hopefully to also motivate them to be the change they seek in the world.
Great, perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and talking about your book, The Racial Muslim, for anybody who wants to go read it. I definitely want to. And as a Muslim myself, I found your talk both to be heartbreaking and motivating. And thank you so much for the work that you do and for talking to us today.
Thank you. All right. Take care, everyone.
Take care.